All right, good day everyone. This is Jason Straight with the Cloud PaaS Virtual Group. Our presentation today is Azure Basics for the DBA, and our presenter is John Morehouse. Before I hand things over to John, though, I just want to do a few quick announcements, and then once those are done, I'll give it over to John, and we'll go through let him go through his entire presentation. If you are interested in presenting, I'm always looking for new presenters. So if you have something to share, whether it is something you've done in Azure, or AWS, or Google, as long as it relates to data in the cloud and you're leveraging some Microsoft technologies, we would love to hear from you. You can just email me at cloud@paas.org. Or if you don't want to send me an email directly to start things off, you can just go out to cloud.paas.org and fill out the form there, and we'll get things rolling and get you onto our schedule. We are planning to continue to do sessions every Tuesday and Thursday at or about this time, so hopefully if you're interested, you'll go out and submit your information. Coming this fall is PaaS Summit 2019, so I think this is the 21st year of the PaaS Summit, so there's quite a bit going on. One of the new pieces is the learning pathways, where you can take an introductory topic that you start in the early part of the week, and then towards the end of the week you can go to more advanced topics within there, and it's got an actual path on how you can go through and learn. If you are interested in learning about this and getting more information, you can go out to the PaaS Summit 2019 Learning Pathways page. If you have yet to register for PaaS Summit and you are planning to do so, you can get a discount off of the current registration cost. All you need to do is leverage this virtual group's discount code, or another virtual group if you so desire, but you'll get $150 off your registration. As I mentioned, there are other virtual groups, and PaaS actually does support quite a few of them. They focus on different areas, such as different technologies like PowerShell, different languages like Global Italian, or just different job roles and aspects of work, such as security and performance. These virtual groups are doing presentations all the time, so do go out to PaaS to register and subscribe to these virtual groups to make sure that you get the information about them and you learn about all their upcoming presentations. With that, those are all the announcements that we have for today. So our presentation today is Azure Basics for the DBA with John Morehouse. And so John, I will make you the presenter now.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming through great.
Awesome. So I do want to take a moment and give you and Ted a shout out. For those that might be listening that don't know, Jason and Ted used to be regional mentors back in the day when I was a chapter leader in Omaha. And I attribute where I'm at today in my career and my community involvement in part to Jason and Ted. So make sure you stay connected to your communities. So thank you, Jason, for all you did for me back in the day.
Oh, you're welcome.
And the other thing is that, Jason mentioned those learning pathways at the PaaS Summit this year. I'm actually doing a let me rephrase that, cloud migration pathway in terms of trying to determine what's the best way to go to the cloud. And it's cloud agnostic, so whether that's Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or Amazon AWS, there is a cloud pathway that you can go learn. So that's perfect fitting for this virtual group. So. With that, I'll move forward. As Jason said, can you guys see my screen? Oh, right, hang on. You guys can't see my screen. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So you should see my screen right now. You get the initial introduction slide for Azure Basics for the DBA. As Jason said, my name is John Morehouse. I'm a consultant with Denny Cherry Associates Consulting, and I got some more information about who I work for in a little bit. My contact information is up there on the slide. You can email me at john@dcac.com. Any questions about the presentation that you might have later after I'm done, or even if you're stuck on a problem and you don't know where to turn, feel free to drop me a line. I'm heavily involved in the community, and the SQL community is great about helping other people. I'm on LinkedIn. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn if you so desire. I do tweet. Twitter is probably my one and only social media platform that I use pretty regularly. And I always have to clarify this. That's SQL R Us, not SQL Russ. So if you think about Toys R Us, everything toys, I'm pretty much everything SQL. I touch just about every facet of SQL Server. But the only thing I don't do is heavy business intelligence stuff. I'm that crazy DBA that likes to reverse engineer hexadecimal at 10:30 on a Saturday night because I don't have a social life. I do blog at sqlrs.com. Usually I blog about the internals of SQL Server. I have been branching out further into the cloud and Azure related topics along with automation and PowerShell because I like to automate things to make my life a hell of a lot easier.
Oh, John, looks like you accidentally muted yourself.
I don't know how I did that, but okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, coming through perfect.
Oh, cool, perfect. Thank you, sir. I do help lead the Louisville SQL Server Power BI user group. I do live in Louisville, Kentucky. I will tell you it took me 18 months to figure out how to say Louisville correctly, and that's a true story. I speak at a number of conferences around the globe, heavily involved with the PaaS community. As I mentioned earlier, I got started way back in the day in like 2005 or 6, and with Jason's guidance, I've come a long way. But MVP, a whole bunch of other badges that you guys can.
Oh, John, looks like you muted again.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I'm going to get this squared away. I promise.
Okay.
Move the context over to the slide deck, and that helps. Denny Cherny Associates Consulting. We're a small shop. We've only got about 6 technical folks and 2 additional HR internal folks, so 8 total. We do a wide range of things with SQL Server, both on-premises and in the cloud. So if you're looking for a consultant, shameless plug, to help come in and design and architect high availability, performance tuning, whatever you might need for SQL Server, we can probably help you out. Feel free to connect up with us. Yeah, that worked. This one's not going to work. So our quick agenda, we're going to talk about the cloud, some terminology, geographies, regions, networking, data security, virtual machines, SQL DB, managed instances, and demos. The demos I have are really about virtual machines and SQL DB. I will tell you that managed instances can take up to 6 hours to generate and or longer. I have seen some reports lately that 12 hours go by and they're still being spun up. So I unfortunately won't have the ability to actually spin that up, but we'll just take a quick look at it. And if you are playing with the cloud, this should be no surprise. We actually still have conversations with individuals who think that when data goes to the cloud, things just disappear into the ether and they get somehow reconstituted back to your local computer like it's magically delicious and just magically appears. And really that isn't the case. If you're new to the cloud, really you're just putting your data and resources on somebody else's computer, whether that's on Microsoft's infrastructure and hardware or Amazon's or Google's, or even the more typical thing that we're now seeing is, excuse me, local providers like Rackspace offering a private cloud. That still means that your data is sitting on a piece of hardware somewhere within their data center. You know, that could be local to your office, or it could be halfway around the world. Who knows? So the cloud really is just somebody else's computer. So terminology. I actually left, and so there's a backstory to this presentation. Years ago, I used to work for actually a couple financial institutions that were kind of gun shy about the cloud. They really didn't want to go to the cloud. They were a financial organization. They were regulated by the U.S. government, and so going to the cloud was a scary proposition for them. And so when I left my former employer, I really wanted to get into the cloud because I think that's the future of data professionals. So if you're not looking at the cloud technology, and again, whether that's Azure or Microsoft or Google, as a data professional, whatever your role might be, you really should start to look at the cloud and how can you leverage that technology to make your organization perform better. When I made that switch, I had a bunch of questions, and some of the terminology was always very difficult for me to get my mind wrapped around it. So that's why this is there, and this is where the other content comes from. So when we talk about on-prem or on-premises, that really means hardware and resources that live within your physical data center that you might be sitting next to. There's always an ongoing debate whether it's on-prem, on-premises, or however you want to say it. Usually when I have those conversations, if it's in the context of the cloud and you say on-prem or on-premises, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the local hardware in your data center. So I personally don't care which version you say. Just be aware that depending on who you're talking to, somebody might get frustrated with you because you use the wrong terminology. So I usually say on-premises just because that seems to be fairly standard these days. Infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, really what that means is that your cloud provider is providing the hardware and usually the virtualization. You have access to the operating system and anything you put on top of that operating system. So if you had an Azure, for example, an Azure virtual machine would be considered infrastructure as a service because I still have access to control and manipulate the operating system that's sitting on top of that virtual machine. But I don't have access to the virtual host underneath that operating system to do anything with. So I can't vMotion it or do anything with that. That is all controlled from the provider level, which in that case was Microsoft. Platform as a service is more where we actually abstract at a higher level above the operating system. So Azure SQL DB can be considered as platform as a service in that we actually abstract away not only the operating system and the virtual host, we actually also abstract away SQL Server entirely. So the only thing we have access to as consumers is the database level and anything above the database level, like an application. So we can control the application and the database, but we can't control SQL Server, we can't control the operating system, and we still can't control the virtual machine underneath the operating system. So, and even with the database as platform as a service, we still are limited to what we can control with the database. So, for example, we can't control TempDB. That is abstracted away from the SQL instance, and so we can't see that. Software as a service, just like I mentioned with platform as a service, we've abstracted away not only SQL Server, now software as a service, we're actually abstracting away the database as well. So the only thing we can really control is the data underneath the hood, and that's about it. So a good example that I always use, at least for the United States folks, I file my taxes with TurboTax. I go to an online web app, and I type in all my information, and hopefully I get a refund back from the federal government. But that is an example of software as a service. I don't have to install anything, and most likely somebody else is managing the hardware underneath the hood, the database, and all the aspects that go along with that. So ADD, Azure Active Directory, and I will tell you that this is just a limited set of terminology. Microsoft is the king and queen of acronyms, and the further you get into the cloud technology, and that's probably agnostic, the acronyms seem to get bigger and bigger and more complex. But Azure Active Directory, for a long time I thought this was very similar to an on-premises Active Directory. Your on-premises Active Directory is a great way to further secure your footprint in your local organization. And I've always thought that Active Directory in the cloud was very similar, and that's not really the case here. Azure Active Directory really is about authenticating applications via an OAuth methodology and not using like Kerberos, which occurs in your local Active Directory. But it's a way to provide that authentication and to help prove I am who I say I am when I log into, in this case, Azure, and I want to play with my Azure resources that I've got in the cloud currently. Azure Resource Manager, this is really how Microsoft makes its money these days. There used to be a classical portal, and I'll show you what the portal looks like today, but a classical portal was just a bear to use, really. But the new Azure Resource Manager allows us to, one, have a new portal and a new way to manage resources. With the classic way, we would have to manage resources one at a time, which gave us single-threaded operations. So for example, if I was standing up a virtual machine, I would have to stand up the virtual machine itself, attach the disk, attach the network, install the operating system or whatever. And if I had to stand up 20 of those virtual machines, most likely I would have to do it in a serial fashion. With Resource Manager, Azure Resource Manager, or the ARM, I can actually facilitate that growth, that scale out of virtual machines very, very quickly and do so in a parallelized manner. I can even script it out or use templates to even make that process more automated and more consistent. So the Resource Manager is what we use today. If you're in the cloud already, especially with Azure, and you have resources that are in the classical mode, I would strongly advise you to look about moving those away from the classical and into the new ARM. And the next one, the LRS, GRS, ZRS, RA, GRS. Confusing, I know. This is about redundancy for storage. So just about everything in Azure, let me rephrase that. A good portion of things in Azure require storage of some sort, whether it's blob storage that you want to upload files and pictures to, or storage for an Azure SQL DB. And by the default is LRS, which stands for locally redundant storage. So by default, Microsoft gives you 3 copies of your data locally to that data center and region for LRS. Okay, so they provide you a certain level of number of nines. I want to say it's 3 nines or 4 nines just with the locally redundant storage. However, if you're like, for those of us that are on the East Coast, Kentucky is considered East Coast, but let's say you're further on the East Coast in New York or somewhere down the Eastern Seaboard, locally redundant storage might not give you the appropriate level of RPO or RTO in a disaster recovery scenario. For example, the East Coast people get to deal with a weather event known as hurricanes. And hurricanes can come along and have been known to wipe out complete data centers. So if you're using locally redundant storage and you wipe out a data center or several data centers, your data might be at risk for not being able to be recovered. So again, you might need to check that out when you start looking at the storage types for cloud technology. GRS is geographical redundant storage. So one of the beauties with the cloud, and I as a data professional, I love this flexibility. I can very easily and relatively quickly replicate data from the East Coast to the West Coast with geographically redundant storage. Even using like SQL DB, I can actually geo-replicate a database from one side of the country to the other pretty quickly, and that gives me a higher level of redundancy with my data. So I can tell Azure, hey, I want my data, I'm going to use GRS as my storage, and I'm going to automatically geo-replicate it to another data center somewhere else in the United States to help prevent globally region-specific disasters from affecting my data. Now, the other thing I want you to think about when you talk about the cloud, failures do happen. We make mistakes. We're all human, and things do go bump. As a data professional, don't think that you're going to go to the cloud and everything is going to be up all the time. I've got clients that have had production outages that are solely in the cloud because mistakes were made and or mistakes were made at the cloud provider level. So mistakes can happen. So when we talk about the cloud, make sure you think about disaster recovery and high availability for whatever you need for your organization to function. ZRS is zone redundant storage. So within a geographic region with Azure, there are zones within that geographic region. So, and we can specify that within that geographic region, we want multiple zones to be redundant. So I could have data in one data center and then data in a separate data center that's usually 100 miles apart. So that's not totally geographic, you know, the span from East Coast to West Coast, but a zone redundant would still have some redundancy at a higher mileage footprint, if you will. You know, it's further away than what your primary data is sitting, and still gives me a level of redundancy. Now, with GRS, since it's geographically redundant storage, if you do GRS, I can't read that secondary, but they offer a RA GRS storage type, which is read accessible. So if I was uploading a bunch of files to blob storage and my application needed to read it, and I've got end users in the West Coast, but I'm primarily hosted in the East Coast, I can use RA GRS storage, replicate the data to the West Coast, allow my users to read it, and therefore they actually would get a faster or a lower latency time because they can read that data directly from that secondary site on the West Coast. One of the other things I want you to think about when you talk about the cloud, and I don't care what provider you go to, we actually have a saying at DCAC.com or DCAC that we've been throwing around is physics always wins. So you can use cloud technology to get data closer to your local users. For example, if I had a client that was worldwide, I could use Azure resources to replicate data closer to my end users, let's say in Germany. And because physics always wins, instead of coming all the way across the ocean to hit a resource in the East US, if you will, we can actually stand up resources in Germany so that they only hit that local data center right there. And so their latency is much, much smaller. So keep that in mind. Physics always wins. I need to make a sticker about that. But resource groups, so everything goes in a resource group. Let's just put it that way. A resource group really is, and the way I equate this is really, I've got a Tupperware container, I've got a bowl, if you will, and in that bowl I put everything that I need to have to facilitate my solution, whether that's a virtual machine, a SQL database, maybe it's a firewall, maybe it's some blob storage. All of those items would then go into a resource group. What's really beautiful about a resource group is it facilitates easy cleanup. In the old way with the classical manager, we would have to pick apart all those pieces if we wanted to change them and or delete them. Whereas a resource group, I can say delete the resource group, and automatically it'll delete all the resources that are in that lives within that group. So essentially, I'm taking that bowl, I want to delete it, I flip it over, everything that's in the bowl falls out, and life goes on. Okay. Geographies and regions. So the world is basically broken up into geographies and regions. And with the regions, we don't really see data centers. We only see regions. We don't know, and I talk about this in a little bit, we don't know where our data is actually sitting. And for those of you that might be concerned about security with the cloud, at least from a Microsoft perspective, I know that the people that work in the individual regions and data centers don't even know whose data they are working with within the data center, so they can't identify your data to say that, hey, this database belongs to John Morehouse. And for the Microsoft employees that don't work in the data centers, they can't identify where my data is actually living. So Microsoft does a very good job in terms of geographies and regions to make sure that everything is secure, not only from a technical standpoint, but also from a physical standpoint. So this is and if you've been in the cloud, this is probably a really common representation that you've seen on the internet. And again, it's cloud agnostic basically, but this one in this case is Microsoft, because I really like the Azure platform over all the others. That's just my preference. We actually have clients that use AWS, so we play with both, but I really like the Microsoft platform. So on the far left, we've got the on-premises version. Everything in blue is what we manage, and this would be indicative of the old school. We manage everything that's in our local data center within our building, whether that's the networking, the servers, the virtualization, the hardware, and the applications from the ground up. We get to manage that. Infrastructure as a service. Everything in green that you see is managed by Microsoft. So again, they would control the networking, the storage, the servers, the virtualization. We would be able to control the operating system and anything else we put on top of that operating system. Platform as a service. Again, we can see that green graph go further up in the chain. So we've abstracted more away from the consumer. And the only thing we have access to is the data or the database and the applications. So remember I said that Azure SQL DB is a platform as a service. I can't see that middleware of the SQL instance or the operating system. All I can see is the database and the data that it contains and any applications I put on top of that. Software as a service, the whole gambit, the whole kit and caboodle is managed by Microsoft, and we don't really get to touch anything. So really the question is, where does the level of granularity control that you want? So when you think about going to the cloud and start to use cloud resources, how much control do you really want for your organization? If you're an anal retentive data professional like I am, I really like the infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, but everybody has their own requirements and what would fit best for your organization. So you have to think about that in terms of what level of control can you live with or live without, and that'll kind of help to define where you land your data and or your resources in the cloud. One of the This is, I think this one is a little bit easier, and you'll probably see this on the internet too. Really equates like pizza as a service. And I am a huge pizza fan. That's nowhere close to my diet, so I haven't had pizza in a long time. But if we think about pizza as a service, on the far left, the traditional on-premises is that I would make the whole thing at home. I'd make the dough. I'd have all the sauces and the toppings. I would put all that together. I would cook it. I would have the dining table. I'd set the table, whole gambit. Infrastructure as a service would be represented as a either a take and bake, and I always reference a Papa. It's a chain called Papa Murphy's. It's a store that you could actually walk into, and they would have pizza dough ready. You would tell them that you want a vegetarian pizza, and they would have it ready, and you would actually just buy the dough pre-made with all the toppings. You would take it home, and then you would bake it. Another concept would be DiGiorno for those in the United States. You can go to your local grocery mart probably and get a DiGiorno pizza that is frozen. You just throw it in the oven and you bake it. That would be equivalent to infrastructure as a service. Platform as a service, I'm going to call my local Papa John's. For those that might not know, Papa John's Pizza was founded and headquartered here in Louisville, Kentucky. Like Seattle has Starbucks on every corner, I have a Papa John's on just about every corner of the city. So I can call my local Papa John's and get pizza delivered. And the only thing I really have to provide is whatever I'm drinking and a place to eat it. So I'm going to platform as a service. I got the dining room table and my soda. Software as a service, I'm going to go to my local Papa John's and let them do everything. So I think this whole graph is just a really good representation of the different platforms that we have from a cloud provider. And so I like this. This is a good analogy for things. Okay, I know we're doing questions at the end. I'm going to move this. So I mentioned briefly about geographies and regions. Obviously, the world is divided by geographies, not only from a physical perspective, but also from a geopolitical boundaries. And the regions contained within, oh, they didn't go. Yep, there we go. A region is defined by a bandwidth and latency envelope. Usually regions are a couple hundred miles apart. And again, we don't see those data centers that are contained within those regions. So for example, region 1 might actually contain 10 different data centers, and region 2 might contain 15. I don't know what that really is. So we don't talk about data at a data center level of granularity. The region is really the only thing that we get to see and play with. So when I stand up a new virtual machine in Azure, I can say that I want it in the East US region, which is somewhere on the East Coast towards the middle of the United States, or I could say I want to go place it in the East region of South Africa, and I can actually put data there. I will say one thing to keep in mind when you start playing around with, especially with data in other countries, if you start to play around with the cloud and put data in other countries, there was this big data privacy regulation that came out from the UK last year sometime, GDPR, hope that rings a bell for everybody. Each country can have their own regulations and what you can do with that data. So I've been trying to just tell people, if you're going to put data in certain countries, make sure you have somewhat of an understanding as to what you can do with that data, because sometimes some countries say that once you put data there, it can't leave that geographical boundary. So just be cautious with that. And Microsoft's not going to warn you, because Microsoft doesn't have the resources to tell you, hey, be aware that you can't take data out, or you can't do this X, Y, and Z with that data due to local regulations. So just be cautious with that. To prove the investment that Microsoft has had with the cloud, this is a data center in Quincy, Washington. You can see here that the data center is pretty large and vast. The air handlers down there in the bottom are pretty big. I actually have tried to find somebody or an object in there for scale. You can see that Microsoft has invested quite a bit of infrastructure into the cloud technology. And this was taken a couple years ago to just show as an example. Microsoft has expanded this particular data center. You can see that they've actually, and I think this picture is from 2017 or 2018, so it's a couple years old. But Microsoft has continued to expand the cloud technology. So if you think that the cloud technology is a fad, I'm afraid that you're highly mistaken. The cloud is here to stay. And again, if you're a data professional and you're not investigating the cloud or at least looking at it, you really should be. So make sure you take some time just to investigate the cloud technology as a whole. And again, I don't care whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or Google, pick a cloud provider and just start to go play around. Regions, and we talked about region. This is an old picture. So right now, this is the most recent picture of the regions that we have available to us in the Azure cloud. I assume I've not looked at the Google or Amazon region list, so I assume that it's relatively probably similar to this. But as you can see, that we can actually put data anywhere around in the world. For those of us that are old enough to remember back in the day when we had physical hardware, and that was the only thing we could do, the cloud wasn't invented yet, trying to get data closer to our end users, because physics always wins, was a complete nightmare. I remember back in the day working for a consulting firm, and we attempted to do that even across the United States or even across a different state was very difficult. We had to obtain a physical space somewhere. We had to lease the space. We had to retrofit it and potentially modify it to fit our needs. We'd have to find telephone companies and data providers to get access to actually put data there, and set up networking and VPN and security and physical security. And it was just a 6-month, 8-month, year-long process that was very difficult to control. With the power of cloud technology, one of the really cool things is that I can actually put data just about anywhere in the world to facilitate the needs of my end users. A good example is the DCAC website. We recently, within the last month or so, and DCAC is actually based out of California, so primarily our website and stuff is hosted on the West US region over here. But recently, we actually scaled that out, and actually we put copies of the website in several different regions around the world. For example, we actually did some testing from Australia. We've got colleagues in Australia, and we asked them to do some load testing for us. And because physics always wins, their data requests would actually travel all the way back to the West US and back to Australia to where their home office or wherever they're sitting. And the latency for that was horrible. And so what we did is we actually stood up a local copy in Southeast Asia, I believe. And because that copy of the data is much closer, the latency between Australia and Southeast Asia was significantly less. And so the end users for hitting our website, their user experience was a lot better. So I think the cloud technology and the hyperscale that Azure offers anyways really helps us to get data closer to our consumers very, very quickly. I can stand up a virtual machine in Southeast Asia relatively quickly, just as fast as I can in East US. Previously, again, for those of us that are old enough, that was unheard of back in the day. And for those of you that might work for the US government, there's even US government specific regions, so Department of Defense and US Gov, that if you work for a government entity, you can get access to. So and that has obviously, of course, enhanced security because it's a government region. And for those of us that don't work in the government sector, like myself, I don't even have access to that government facility. So I can't put resources there. I can't put data there. That is strictly limited to government and Department of Defense customers. Okay. Regions. So one of the things, and understand that I'm a data professional. I'm probably more than dangerous with networking and some of the back-end technology. Oh, you're seeing that wrong slide. Oh, shoot. That's probably better. So I was always curious when I came into the cloud technology, how do we actually get to the cloud? So a couple things that we can do is if we stood up cloud resources, I can actually extend my on-premises network to include the cloud. I can actually assign a cloud resource once I get things connected with a gateway or a VPN. I can actually assign a networking subnet that would work in the cloud, and then we can just update our local on-premises routers and route directly to the resource in Azure. Whether that's in East US or across the world, it's relatively easy to set up and bring my own network to the cloud. I worked with, a story I usually tell is I worked with Denny with one of our clients. Denny's my boss. And they were moving their entire SQL Server infrastructure to the cloud, and we had to stand up some virtual machines and whatnot. But all in all, we were able to get them totally connected with their own network and their own new subnets and Azure and all that within a matter of a couple of hours. That's pretty cool. And then we could start the actual data migration of their SQL database and SQL data up to the cloud. But within a couple of hours, we had them connected securely. So it was a secure connection. But to do that within a couple of hours, again, if we think back in the back of the day, that was a complete pain in the butt to even try to think about getting organized. So again, the cloud technology helps us facilitate easier data management. We can do point-to-site VPNs, which is really probably more geared for like dev or test. I wouldn't use a point-to-site VPN for production load. I would actually use a VPN gateway or a site-to-site VPN to get connectivity to the whole organization and local data center to Azure. Or you can use what's called an express route. The express route basically is, as depicted in that lower graphic, is a private tunnel directly to the Microsoft backend fiber. It's a secure connection. Bring your checkbook, bring the money, because from my understanding, it's not very, very cheap. And you have to go find a provider to actually provide that. So you have to go to your local telecom provider. For example, you can call Sprint or Verizon or whoever and see who your local provider is. And so it's just like getting a cell phone or a landline. You got to go find a provider to get you an express route. But you have very, very low latency to Microsoft. So sometimes it is more cost effective to do that. But an express route is another route to actually get there. We have a couple clients that actually use express route, but most of our clients use a VPN gateway or VPN site-to-site, and that latency is enough to facilitate their needs. Again, express route is usually pretty complicated. So as a data professional, the other thing I was always concerned about was data security. So coming into the cloud world from my former life, especially working as a DBA with a financial institution for many years, data security was always very at the top of my list, and it should be at the top of everybody's list if you work in the data. Data security is everybody's job. I don't care whether you're CEO or the janitor. Data security should be top priority. Thankfully, with the cloud, they do a number of things that are on by default. Transparent data encryption, for example, if you stand up a Azure SQL database, TDE is enabled by default. You have to physically turn that off if you want, but so it's enabled by default. So Microsoft says, we want you to encrypt your data, and we're going to turn it on for you. And if you really don't want it, you have to go turn it off. Not sure why anybody would turn it off, but so they want you to be encrypted. They want you to be very secure. Everything's done through a secure transport layer security, TLS, HTTPS. So every time you connect up to the portal and start messing around with data, all your connectivity is secured, especially if you do it from a web browser. If you want to use always encrypted with SQL DB, you can. You can use always encrypted with a SQL virtual machine as well. So you have ways to make sure that your data stays encrypted even when moving to the cloud. Unfortunately, I still run into organizations that have unencrypted data even on premises. So I like the ability that we can still try to get things encrypted and move them to the cloud at the same time. I can still do row-level security. I can still do dynamic data masking. So I have all those security features, even in the cloud, to make sure my data is secure. Because if the cloud's got my data, my personal identification data, I want to make sure that it's as secure as possible. So I'm glad that the cloud provides that level of encryption and security. That helps me sell the cloud to my organization and or my management. Authentication methods, especially from a SQL or data perspective, we can actually use that Azure Active Directory authentication. So we can use the Azure Active Directory to actually authenticate a user to a SQL database. And so as I mentioned, that Azure Active Directory is an identity management tool. And so we can identify that, yep, John is who he says he is. And so we're going to grant him access to see this database or see this table or what have you within Azure. I can also use SQL authentication if I wanted to. I prefer the Active Directory authentication because I think that's more secure. It's a little bit harder to set up, but you can do it. And I would note that we can actually sync your on-premises Active Directory with the Azure Active Directory. So if you create a user or an object in one, you can actually, it'll sync up to the Azure cloud or vice versa. So we can actually sync that through a process. But data security is the important part here. The cloud technology is as secure as you want it to be. But again, just like with failures and mistakes happen, if you put unencrypted data in the cloud and you have methods to allow hackers to get into your unencrypted data, you still have to be diligent in fixing those holes and finding ways to close those down. We hear about data breaches all the time, unfortunately, and the cloud is not immune to that. There are some things that happen in the cloud to help control that, but still do your due diligence when you move to the cloud or play around with cloud technology, that you don't leave an S3 bucket wide open with sensitive data in it. Because if you can get to the data, even if it's encrypted on the back end, at rest, they can still read it. So just be cautious with that. All right, virtual machines. So one of the very cool things, and I love this, this aspect of cloud technologies, I can spin up a virtual machine in about 15 minutes, give or take. Not only can I spin it up through the portal, I can actually spin it up through automation and templates. So if I wrote a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI script, I can, or use a template, which is basically a JSON format, I can actually spin that up and scale things very, very quickly. With a virtual machine, if we had an on-premises server, in order to actually scale that, we had to order the new hard drives, we had to order the new memory or the new CPUs, or we had to order the brand new chassis with new cables, HBA cables or whatever they're saying, and that was always a 6-month process. With virtual machines in the cloud, I can actually just take a quick reboot and resize that virtual machine. You do have to take an outage if you scale the virtual machine up or down because you have to reboot it, but I can scale that server back up to twice the number of cores, twice the amount of memory, twice the temporary storage, whatever I need to do for my organization relatively easily with Azure virtual machines. So that's really, really cool. They changed that. You actually pay by the second now when it's running. So one of the things to think about when you start playing around with cloud technology is that the cloud provider wants your money. That's the way the world works, unfortunately. They want the green dollar bills. And so if you leave things running, Microsoft will be very happy to send you a bill and say, hey, you left this resource running and you need to pay us the $1,000 or whatever it might be. So if you start to play around with Azure or any cloud provider, make sure, double check that you don't walk away and leave especially resource intensive items running in the cloud without being used. So if I left a virtual machine up for a month or two and it was a very large virtual machine, let's say 16 cores and 64 gigs of memory, Microsoft is not going to care what I did or did not do with it, and they're most likely going to send me a relatively large bill and expect me to pay for it. So just be very cautious when you start to play around with the virtual machines and make sure things are shutting down. I know with the virtual machines today, by default, and I think I mentioned this later at the end of the slide or end of the presentation, Azure virtual machines will by default shut down at 7 p.m. UTC time, which is always an interesting thing. You could be working on that virtual machine and then suddenly it's going to shut down. And that helps with reducing the cost. You can actually use an existing license, so you can actually do a hybrid licensing if you needed to stand up SQL Server on a virtual machine in Azure. So if you've already purchased SQL licenses for on-premises, you can actually use a hybrid methodology and bring your own license, which would help reduce the cost of the Azure virtual machine. If you don't have a license, basically when you create a virtual machine, you rent that SQL license for when it's powered on. When it's powered off, you're not using it, so you don't pay for it. But you only pay for outgoing network and the storage you use. You can put as much data into Azure as you want, but as soon as you take it out then you get charged for not only network, but also the storage. And as I mentioned, the elasticity, you can scale that virtual machine very, very quickly. And this is an example of what and those are actually old. They've actually updated the portal in terms of what they look like, in terms of selecting what kind of virtual machine that I want. As you can see though, the examples still hold. I can choose like a D11, which in that case, it was a 2-core, 14 gig virtual machine that's got some features like an auto scaling. I've got a local SSD of 100 gigs. I've got a max IOPS of 4x500. Or I could go even lower, like an A1 in the lower right, a basic, which is a 1-core, a little less than 2 gigs of memory. And my max IOPS is 2x300. I've got 2 data disks. But there's a wide range of levels of virtual machines that I can pick when I want to create a virtual machine. You can do memory resource intensive that have a higher number of RAM. You can go up to like 4 terabytes of RAM now, I think. They're not cheap, but you can do 4 terabytes of RAM. You can go that's more, I need a processor intensive virtual machine that has 64 cores, 128 cores, whatever your resources need. You can scale that up. They actually have virtual machines now that are GPU, which are video intensive processing. So if you need a GPU type machine to do a heavy amount of CPU processing, you can actually use those virtual machines. Yeah, and virtual machine size determines the auto scale, load balancing. So obviously the higher end virtual machines, you get more perks along with that. But sometimes the lower size virtual machines work just fine. A good example is I've actually got a DNS server sitting up in Azure that does filtering of internet ads for me. And it's it's actually a B1, which is 1 core and I think 2 gigs. And that's totally fine for what I need. And it costs me like $5 a month, but it helps remove all the ads out of my browsing. So SQL DB. So again, this is platform as a service. It's just a database in the cloud. Again, we don't have access to the SQL instance underneath that. We don't even have access to all the system databases. We can't see TempDB. We can't see SQL Server Agent. There's a number of things that we can't see. It's sized differently than the virtual machines. They first came out with a cost method called a DTU, which is a database transaction unit. You can still select that today, and the graphic depicts what that scale kind of looks like. So we can see that I can pick a P1, which is 125 DTUs for $465 a month, or I can scale that all the way up to like a P11 for 1750 DTUs at $7,000 a month. Or I could go even higher to like a P15, which is significantly more expensive. You can't see it there on that graphic. And really the DTU is just this magical formula that Microsoft came up with that takes a combination of compute resources, memory utilization, storage, and comes up with this magical number to say this is how it's computed, and based off what you use is what you get charged. They've actually moved away from that by default. They've actually, a couple of years ago, they came out with a vCore licensing, so I can actually say, I need an Azure SQL DB database, and I just need 2 cores. That's all I need. I just need 2 cores. So I can actually configure that, and I would get 2 virtual cores dedicated to that database. And by default now, any new database that you spin up in Azure, a SQL DB, platform as a service again, you actually get defaulted into that vCore licensing model, and I think it's a Gen 5 2 vCore licensing. And one thing to keep in mind, if you do a Google search for Azure calculator, Microsoft has actually provided a really decent calculator that you can kind of configure what you think you might need in terms of resources and compute power, and figure out how much that's going to cost you. Couple things about SQL DB that are really nice. You don't have access to the physical database files. That's a pro and con as a database professional. What's really nice that I like is that I don't need to upgrade. I don't have to do patching. Microsoft does that for me. So I don't need to upgrade the operating system. I don't need to patch SQL. I don't need to upgrade SQL. I don't need to reboot or restart SQL or the box. That's all managed by SQL Server or by Microsoft. Remember that we've abstracted away not only the SQL instance, but also the virtual machine. Automatic backups. This is, as a data professional, way too often recently we've run into clients that they have backups, but they're not validated and or they don't have backups. And the fact that Microsoft says, if you do SQL DB, we're going to automatically back up your database whether you like it or not. You can't control that, but it's automatic. By default, you get, I believe, 7 days of retention for that backup. They do a full backup once a week, a differential every 12 hours, and a transaction log backup every 5 minutes. You can't control that. You can't switch that on or off. They pretty much say, tough, that's what we're going to do. And again, TDE is enabled by default with SQL DB, which is a great thing. The other beauty is that when Microsoft rolls out updates for SQL Server, guess where it goes? Yep, it goes to SQL DB first. So you're always on the latest and greatest release of SQL Server if you're using Azure SQL DB, again, platform as a service. So it's kind of cool that that's the first place that things get tested. What it looks like is this. This is pretty much what SQL DB looks like. On the left, this is Management Studio. We can see that I'm connected to a SQL DB Test 1 server in the cloud. I can see the master database. I can see my local database of Test 1. I can see all the objects within that. But underneath that, it's missing all those server level items in the tree that we normally would see with an on-premises SQL Server or a virtual machine SQL Server. I can see the security, and that's pretty much it. Again, we can't see SQL Agent. So in order to facilitate that, we would have to use something like runbooks or Azure Functions to facilitate actually reaching into that SQL DB and manipulating the data on like a schedule basis. Okay, managed instances. This is Microsoft's attempt to really answer that middle tier between a virtual machine and SQL DB. So if you think about it as a stack where SQL DB is on the top and a virtual machine with SQL Server installed is kind of at the bottom, managed instances would actually fall in between those. Because with managed instances, we can actually see more of the SQL instance itself. So as we can see here, this is pretty much what it would look like. Here I can see TempDB and all the system databases. I can see the security. I have SQL Agent, so I can run agent jobs. I can see the management and the logs. I still can't see the virtual machine under the hood, but in this case, it looks just like a normal on-premises SQL Server or a virtual machine SQL Server. I still can't see the virtualization of the operating system under the hood. So that's kind of what it looks like. Command line. So as a data professional, I wanted to throw this out here because I like to automate things and I like to be able to script things out. So if you're like me and you want to be able to script and automate and use command line, PowerShell is very, very powerful with Azure. I prefer the newer Azure command line interface, or CLI. Azure CLI. I think the Azure CLI is a lot cleaner, and I've got an example, and I'll show you the difference between the two here in a second. But you can do this, and not only can you do this from like your local machine, as you can see here on the graphic in the top right, that's actually my local workstation. So I can actually install some components from Microsoft and actually run these directly from my local command line and interface with my Azure resources. I can create things, I can destroy things, I can move things. Not only can I do it locally, I can also do it from the dashboard, the portal. So you can see in the lower right, I can actually do a PowerShell cloud shell where I can actually connect and interact with my resources and write PowerShell commands directly through the browser and interact with those resources. It's pretty cool. So here's real quick. I think we're getting close to our time limit, but I got a couple things to show. Let's see what I can do. So hopefully you guys can see this. Yep. So I just mentioned the command line, and we'll show this really quick. So this is a PowerShell command or a script that just really shows kind of the complexity that you have to have with PowerShell. So this, let's see, it's 64 lines long of PowerShell, and I will say that this script is actually the old methodology. Microsoft is actually reverting these Azure RM commandlets to AZ commandlets, and so right now they're kind of in the mix of that. So these will still work, but they actually want you to switch over to the AZ version. which I probably need to do with this script. But we can see here that, I get a bunch of information. I get what location, what region I want. What am I going to name the resource group? What kind of storage do I want? This is locally redundant. Remember, I got to configure the network resource. So I got to configure basically the NIC card. What kind of IP address do I need? What size of virtual machine I need? What image do I want? In this case, I want Microsoft SQL Server 2017 development on Windows Server 2016, and I want the latest edition. And then I do all this work and create it. Sounds cool. This would totally work if I run it. CLI is much simpler. So I do the exact same thing in CLI, and this is CLI, so AZ virtual machine create. I provided all the information that I need, and this one line of code, I can do the exact same thing that this does. So this one line of code would actually stand up a virtual machine for me. In this case, I've called it John's demo as the resource group. I provided a username and password in the same size and the same storage, and it would stand up a virtual machine for me. And I don't have to worry about any additional networking or anything else that this script goes out there and handles. So I personally think that Azure CLI is a much cleaner way to facilitate that. For example, so if I have this DOS window, and we can see there I had just deleted it, but I could easily do, if I wanted to create a new resource group, that's a pretty straightforward command. No, it doesn't like that because I need to write the location. And I want to put this resource group in the East US region. We can see it's going to sit here and think for a second, but then it came back, and we can actually go double check. I look at the dashboard. I go to resource groups here on the left. We can see I now have a resource group called John's Demo. That was pretty easy to interact with, even from a DOS window, and we can see that I don't have any actual resources within the portal. And for those of you that might not have never seen the portal is very clean. I think the Microsoft's version of the portal is super clean. We can see in the upper right that I'm actually in my my own subscription. On the left, I've got a navigation window. I can actually see all the resources. One of the things I will tell you is that by default, you don't actually see things in here. For example, you might want to start to play around with elastic pools with SQL DB. If you're looking for something and you can't find it in that left-hand menu, go to All Services, type in what you think, if I can spell. So let's say I want to see SQL Server Elastic Pools. If you click the star, it'll highlight it and then put it in your left-hand navigation. So if you don't see things over here first, go to All Resources and do a search, and then hit the star, and it will add it to your favorites. Pretty easy to manage through the portal. One of the things I really like about the portal is I can do metrics utilization. For example, I've got a SQL DB called Demo 1. I can see what's my log IO. I don't know if you guys can see that. I can see my log IO percentage, what's the max, what's the CPU, what's the data. So you can actually see in relatively near time. It's not exactly real time, it's a couple minutes delayed, but you can see very easily on this dashboard. It's totally customizable. So if you have multiple resources, you can add and remove resources to whatever dashboard that you might need. Up here on the right, I can actually start my Cloud Shell. So we can see that I've actually started a PowerShell Cloud Shell here. And so I can actually interact with, again, either using Azure CLI or native PowerShell right here in the browser and do things with my Azure resources. It's pretty cool. One of the other things I want to show real quick, because I know we're getting close to being out of time. And one of the things, again, the power of the hyperscale that Microsoft offers, at least, with data security and high availability and disaster recovery, I can replicate things pretty quickly across the United States. So in this case, I've got a database that is sitting on a server that is in East US. I can actually go into geo-replication. We can see the map of the world. All the green dots indicate where I can actually replicate data to. The purple dot is actually the sister region to where I'm at now. So West US is the sister region to East US. And so in this case, I don't have anything configured. I can actually come in here. I'm going to pick the database name is the same. It's readable. I've already got a server sitting over there, so I'm just going to use that. I don't have a pool. I'm going to click OK. Up in the right, we get a warning. Now we can see that we can see this blue dotted line moving, and it's going from East US to the West US. In this case, I'm actually doing, and under the hood is actually a SQL Server availability group, distributed availability group. So I'm actually creating a new node on a server sitting across the country. Of course, this database is empty. It's very, very small, so it shouldn't take too long. And eventually that line will turn a solid color, meaning that I'm fully replicating my data from the East Coast all the way over to the West Coast. And if I wanted to, I could actually take it a step further and do failover groups and actually have high availability with my SQL database. Again, think about this years ago. This was unheard of. It was a very difficult thing to organize and architect because of your limitations as to what you could do with on-premises technology. The cloud, though, however, really facilitates us as data professionals to ensure that we have high availability and disaster recovery processes in place, because it's very easy to facilitate this. I've basically geo-replicated a database across the United States in a matter of 2 clicks, basically. Might be 3 or 4 if you had to configure a secondary server somewhere else other than your local region. And then once this is done, I'll actually be able to not only read that secondary, and if I had a failover group, I could actually control implement a controlled failover to that other region. So I think that's just a really cool demo, and normally that would be done by now, but okay. And I showed you the differences between PowerShell and Azure CLI. Very, very easy. Let's see if we can get through this. Almost done, I promise. I already talked about the auto shut off on virtual machines. Again, just make sure that you watch what you're doing. The storage, you can actually configure your virtual machine with your standard spinning hard drives, the old school spinning hard drives, or there's different levels of solid state drives. They actually came out with a Ultra SSD, which is very, very low latency and high amount of IOPS. It's relatively expensive. If you have anything with production workload on it, I highly recommend at least the premium level solid state drives. And stay away from you'll get a much better latency and performance out of the premium level than you will your standard spinning disks. The SQL DB, you can't get the backups, you can't see where it is. That's one of the things that Microsoft controls for you. You can restore it to a server, Azure SQL DB server, so you could restore it there. You can't go get it and fetch it and bring it down. You can't bring it down to your local, oh, that's the wrong one. Just realized that. Yeah, that's better. Mobile capabilities. I mentioned this because this is really cool too. There's actually, I assume that, and normally and when I do this in person, I would hold up my cell phone. I've got an iPhone 8. If you have a relatively modern smartphone, Microsoft actually has a mobile app. You can control start and stop resources from the mobile app. True story, I was actually working with a client with Denny, and unfortunately I didn't have access to what we needed to get done. Denny did, but Denny was having problems with his laptop at the time, and he was actually able to install the mobile app on his phone, and I think he's got an Android phone. He was actually able to install it, get connected to the client's subscription, and run a PowerShell command from his phone to facilitate what the client needed directly from his phone. I'm hesitant to write PowerShell on my phone because I've got fat thumbs on a small keyboard. I will most likely mistype something and probably break things. So, but I can at least start and stop things relatively easy from my phone. Another good example is when I travel for any reason, I actually have a VPN server in the cloud that I use for secure communications. Usually when I'm in the Louisville airport, I go to my phone. I can actually start that virtual machine from my phone. And then when I come back from my trip and land, I can just shut it down directly from my phone. pretty cool and easy. Getting started, if you're not in Azure yet, Microsoft and the other providers actually do this too. Microsoft will offer you a free trial. If you go to azure.com/free, you can get 12 months free of compute, storage, network, and database, and you get $200 to actually try it out within 30 days. So within 30 days, you can play around with anything that you want. Keep in mind, if you use for example, a very large virtual machine, you can chew through that $200 pretty quickly. So if you're going to mess around with that, start with some small things so you don't consume that credit all in one big, within an hour. Your footprint from a spend perspective can get pretty large. We have clients that spend 6 figures a month in Azure resources, so it can get pretty spendy. Here's some resources, and I think that I can give the slide deck in PDF format to Jason, and we can put it on the cloud on the chapters archive. But if that's not possible, then you guys can email me and ask for it, and I'd be happy to provide a PDF version of the slide deck if you guys want it. But here's a bunch of resources for you about various things in the cloud. And question time. I think I went over a little bit, Jason.
Questions here, and let's just go through them. So the first one is what, and I think you pretty much answered this one, but I'll still ask it anyways. What programming languages do you recommend to automate tasks in Azure SQL Server?
What programming languages? So it would depend on, I prefer the Azure CLI. My secondary was PowerShell.
Okay. Sounds great. And there was a couple questions about the slide deck, and we do have a spot on the meeting archive that we can get that put up to.
I'll send you the PDF.
All right, perfect. Is there a difference in how you configure SQL memory in the cloud? Do you still need to leave some for the OS?
So great question. If you are using a Azure virtual machine, yes, you'd still want to control and limit how much memory SQL Server has, because remember, as a virtual machine, you're going to have access to the operating system. So you could have a virtual machine, put SQL Server, reporting services, analysis services, SharePoint, IIS, and believe me, that actually happens. We run into it all the time. So you still want to be able to control that at a virtual machine level. If you're using SQL DB or managed instances, you don't have access to that.
Okay, great. And what is the name of the Azure phone app?
Well, that's a great question. Hang on. I think it's, if you go to the store, at least from the iPhone perspective, I'm an iPhone, it's called Azure. I think if you go to the iPhone store app and just do a search for Azure, it's got the Azure logo on it.
Okay, great.
Download. It's free. There's no cost to it. The other cool thing about the mobile app is you can actually manage multiple subscriptions. So I can actually not only manage my own, but I can put my clients in there and manage their resources right there. Totally cool.
Yeah, and can you do high availability groups where one is on-prem and the other is in Azure?
Yes. Yep, that's just basically a distributed availability group.
Cool. Those are all the questions. There was a couple last comments about where those are. The slides will be hosted. That'll be at cloud.paas.org. Right on the meeting archive page, there'll be a link that has this presentation, and then the slide deck will be there. So with all the questions done and it being about 10 after, I'm going to close things up for today. Thanks, John, for doing the presentation, and thanks everyone for coming in attending.
Yeah, sorry I ran a little long.
It's no problem. I think everyone enjoyed it. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks.